This is the Mox Team Zirconia podcast, episode 21, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Welcome to Mox Team Zirconia. I'm Colin.
And I'm Graham, and we are your hosts. We are a podcast about Magic the Gathering for everyone.
And we want to inspire you to try out your own brews, pick up an untested deck like one of ours, for example, try it out, and then change it to suit your needs.
Remember, our immediate goal is always, and will always be, to make the next deck better than the last one.
We want to bring you with us as we get better and better at making decks, so that you will be excited and have as much fun making decks as we do.
That's right. And a friendly reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at MoxZirconia and let us know what you think of the podcast.
Don't forget, we need your help to spread the word about this podcast, so please tell your Magic playing friends and also subscribe on iTunes and leave a review if you can.
And word has been spreading, so thank you so much and welcome to all of our new listeners.
Reminder to our new and returning listeners, our episodes are up on YouTube, so please subscribe there because we have big plans for more videos in the future, and you can search Mox Zirconia to find them. Okay, so with the formalities out of the way, Graham, welcome back to the podcast for another week.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a little bit about how our last brew went, which was our red and blue tempo strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about where the metagame is at after GP Pittsburgh, which happened last weekend. And then we're going to go into another brew for a new brew for today. So...
if you guys remember last week, we brewed a deck with Chris from the Girlfriend Bracket, who stopped by to chat with us about a few things. And we ended up building a blue-red tempo deck, which is a little bit out of our comfort zone. So it was a really unique and educational experience.
Yes, because as previously mentioned, neither of us are really tempo or control players. So it was really great to try something a little bit different and see how that could potentially fit into the metagame for Standard. So, Graham, in testing, how did the deck go?
Not super great. We had some issues with the testing. There were some issues with the deck. There are some issues that are question marks because of issues with testing. So I had another unfortunate case of the variances, which is a pretty unfortunate and annoying way to work, especially since I don't actually have enough time due to, real life to give myself a big enough sample size to kind of work out the variance. I think out of all of the games we played, and we played quite a few, we played probably 12 or 14 actual hands. I hit all my land drops up to turn 5, I think twice. And on the times that I did, I usually got flooded. So I either ended up getting starved or ended up getting flooded. And that in itself was somewhat educational, so we learned some things about the deck in terms of how tempo works and why it's important that every turn we are affecting the board in some way. Every single turn we need to be deflecting or bouncing or shutting down our opponent's board. That's really important. And I learned that some cards are just too expensive to run in tempo decks, especially cards that don't perform that function.
Yeah, one quick thing on the variance. If you're running a certain number of lands, there's probabilities that you will get flooded sometimes. There's probabilities that you will get mana screwed sometimes and miss land drops. But the reason that it was a problem for our testing is because when we make a deck every week, we give ourselves very, very limited time to test it out and report on it. And so when you get an extreme case of variance where you're flooding every time or you're getting mana screwed every time, it means that we can't get the kind of results out of the deck that we feel like it deserves because we don't have enough time to get over that variance hump and get more games in so that we can see, so we can get games where we're hitting sort of the statistical probability of getting mana screwed and flooded and getting good draws and that kind of thing.
That's right. That being said, we did learn about the deck. It didn't perform quite up to our expectations. I think that our lack of free time for testing in general is probably problematic for a deck of this type. This is a deck that probably requires more tuning than most other decks. It's especially since we're so unfamiliar with the deck type. We don't play tempo pretty much ever. So of course it's going to be harder for us to get it right on the first crack. We're going to need to tweak it and play with it and tune it a lot before it actually works. And we did some of that, and as we did it, it got better. That is very true. The first couple games, we just got absolutely rolled. We got annihilated. There's nothing we could do about it until we started. But we had to get games under our belt in order to figure out what we needed to change. And once we did that, we kind of started getting the hang of it. And so we made a bunch of changes to it, and we kind of stuck with the things that worked and started cutting the things that didn't. One thing that we noticed that didn't work super well was Mercurial Geist, which is a really, really great card. I love it a lot, but it costs way too much dang mana. I had to choose constantly on turn 4, do I want to play one Mercurial Geist and risk it being hit with removal, or do I want to use my bounce spell to continue to slow down my opponent, or take something, their Heart of Kirin off the board, or take their Greenbelt Rampager off the board, or take their Rishkar off the board. And in the cases where I decided to play the Mercurial Geist, sadly, most of the time it got removed, which is devastating in a deck where you only have 8 creatures. If one of your 8 creatures gets removed, you're kind of screwed. And that was one thing that we learned, and I think we probably took too long to realize that. But by the end, we had taken out all the Mercurial Geists and upped the number of creatures we had in the deck, which I think was a really, really important kind of milestone for us when we were kind of figuring out this deck strategy, is that we wanted cheaper creatures that could be played earlier and at less of an expense of other cards in our hand, so that we could play a creature for like a Storm Chaser Mage or a Sanguinary Mage, so that we can Sanguinary Mage, so that we could also play the bounce spell on our opponent's turn if need be, or keep one of the counter spells in our hand to protect our limited number of creatures that we had in play. We discovered that Prowess worked the way we wanted to. It was a little underpowered, but we also knew that was the case. The nice thing about Prowess versus the Mercurial Geists, because the Mercurial Geist doesn't have Prowess. It's got kind of a weird similar thing, but it only fires off with instant and sorcery spells. So that means our Fevered Visions didn't trigger it, and it doesn't get a bump in its toughness. So later on, and well, actually rather quickly, we figured out that we really wanted to have Kozilek's Return in the deck, and so having that extra bump up in the toughness was kind of an important thing. Obviously, Mercurial Geist doesn't die to Kozilek's Return, but just having the ability for it to get a higher toughness was important.
Yeah, so it felt like we weren't getting the payoff for bouncing the spells because we weren't drawing enough creatures, or we weren't feeling like we're going to take your crew creature off the board so that your vehicle's just sitting there, and now we attack you. But we didn't have that ability to get in and attack and like needle through and get that life total down far enough that we could, finish it off later in the game. So it felt like we were able to control pretty well. Games actually went a bit longer than I expected. But when they were going longer and we were just maintaining, we weren't ever getting those little edges and getting ahead like we wanted to, unfortunately, with the balance that we ended up with at the end of our brew last week. But then that's okay, because that's what first draft decks are for, and that's what experimenting into new archetypes will do as you're learning these things and you're getting these things. And I definitely feel like I personally should have listened a little bit more and not pushed so hard into the tempo direction, because I think that Chris's instincts were actually correct, going in a more hard control, disallow, take things out for real and don't let them play them again sort of direction in the way that the standard format is currently set up. It's very, very difficult to control tempo. And it's difficult anyway, because tempo really requires you to have a lot of things that go right at the same time. Have the right spells, draw the right cards, get the land the way you want, and make it work that way. And so we probably, with 8 creatures in a true control deck that does take everything out of your way and put it in the graveyard instead of back into their hands, I think that is totally good. And we were definitely lacking that final big push, like the Torrential Gear Hulk or the big payoff card that control decks normally have. And so we managed to get a little bit closer using Kozilek's Return, which was a champion, and Fever Visions, and definitely won some games that way. But it really felt like we're like, okay, I know what's in the rest of my list. I know where I am. I'm only 5 or 6 life behind in this, and they're not able to get a lot of creatures out. I keep killing the creatures, but I just know that the inevitability is they're just going to be dropping lands and playing bigger and bigger spells, and eventually they're just going to get around me, and I'm not confident that drawing my next 2 Feared Visions is really going to close the game out fast enough. So
Yeah,
that's sort of
absolutely.
where we ended up. But there were some positives actually. The deck it felt like a really good matchup for public enemy number 1, which was Mardu Vehicles. Kozilek's Return just wrecks that deck
absolutely.
and slows it all the way down. And the most success we had with this brew
Against any deck.
Yeah, against any deck was against Mardu Vehicles. So I think that's closest, and we will be seeing a lot of those, and we'll be talking about that a little bit when we talk about the Pro Tour also.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed, and one of the mistakes, and you kind of touched on this briefly, Colin, was that we should have kind of pushed less in a tempo direction and more in a control direction. I think that one of the things that happened was we did have our control bombs in the deck. And those are the Mercurial Geists instead of having tempo creatures. So, like we were saying earlier, the lower casting cost is probably better for tempo because you're just like nickel and diming your opponent to death. Whereas a Mercurial Geist is a heavy hitter over the top, which makes sense for a control deck. That being said, one of the other win conditions that we had in the deck was the Fevered Visions, and when it worked really, really, really well. And that's one of the instances where tempo really did work in our favor, because I was able to continually put my opponent's cards back in their hand, so at the end of their turn, they were at that 4-card threshold to take damage, and then I was able to slow them down enough to get multiple Fever Divisions into play and continually return cards to their own hand. It also allowed me to continue drawing cards, and when I draw cards, I get more bounce spells. When I get more bounce spells, I keep cards in my opponent's hand. They kind of fed itself. What we ended up doing to actually make that work was put in more creatures that were able to block better and were able to be played earlier. That was a huge, huge game changer for us.
Yeah. So once we started making those changes, the deck actually started working a lot better, and when we moved in that direction, but we didn't really have enough time at that point to retest or go through other rounds and see if it would work better. So at this point, the record we feel like is pretty, is pretty inconsequential, because we feel like our testing wasn't really where we needed it to be. But there were definitely positives.
Yeah, and I'm briefly going to touch on a couple of the changes we did make to the deck. We basically took out all of the hard counter spells because they weren't tempo cards, and we switched them to true bounce spells. We dropped out all 4 of the Mercurial Geists and added the Sanguinary Mages to have a lower curve of creatures. We also added in 3 to 4 Kozilek's Returns. We did keep some counter spells in them. I ran 3 to 4 turn-asides, depending on the deck I was facing, because I needed to make sure I could keep my creatures alive. And it did come in handy a couple times. Like we were saying before, with such a low creature count in our deck, the value of those creatures goes up a lot, and it makes removal of said creatures that much more devastating. So protecting them was kind of paramount.
Yep. And I almost wonder if there was some kind of more card draw we could have used to try, or smoothing, or some way to try to help our draws, because the deck performed completely differently when it had Fevered Visions versus when it didn't. Fevered Visions was really the catalyst. When it had that, it was really going, and you could get those things. So, I mean, getting it, instead of bouncing a creature or something, getting a trigger off of something like Contingency Plan and attacking for a couple extra prowess damage, and making sure that you get your lands or your Fevered Visions or your whatever the way you want to, might be an idea or something going forward. But we'll look into stuff like that. Because because Contingency Plan doesn't affect the board, so you have to be careful. But I just felt like we needed a little bit more library manipulation, a little bit more vision, because this deck ended up going so long in games that without Fevered Visions, we were definitely top decking over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some sort of draw mechanic was absolutely necessary. I think Contingency Plan probably would have been the best, because it was 5, any number in the graveyard. Yeah, Contingency Plan definitely. Well, here's another really cool takeaway about this deck is I learned so much, and I had such a good time trying to get the deck to work. I mean, obviously, it's frustrating. If anybody's ever built a deck that didn't do what it was supposed to, or you thought it was going to be just mind-blowing and it just got shut down immediately, it sucks. It's really frustrating. But I had a really good time trying to figure it out and make it work. And it was really exciting as it slowly kind of came together, getting better and better and better. So I promise you this, I'll be back with a better version of this deck. You got me hooked on the idea, Chris, so thanks for that.
Yeah, and it was really fun to see. I think that right now this deck, which is perfectly viable as a strategy normally, this particular standard just maybe that's the reason why we're not seeing these kind of decks a lot in standard, because it's just maybe just the metagame is against it right now.
Yes, I agree. I think that the metagame right now is very aggressive. You look at the top decks, most of the creatures and big spells in those decks are 2 to 3 mana or 2 or under. Think about your Mardu vehicles. You've got Toolcraft Exemplar, 1 drop. Thraves, 1 drop. Inventor's Apprentice, 1 drop. Scrapheap Scrounger, 2 drop. You've got Veteran Motorist, 2 drop. You've got Heart of Kirin, 2 drop. I mean...
And that's the engine. That's what you need. Yeah.
That's it. That's the whole deck, except for, a couple Pia Nalars and a Gideon or 2. That's it. That's everything in the deck, and a couple control spells. So when you're bouncing one creature at a time, it's really hard to keep up with that, because their cards are so cheap that they can just keep throwing them out 1 or 2 at a time at that point, and you just get overwhelmed.
Yeah, and the metagame right now is extremely low to the ground and wide and fast. Like, according to MTG Goldfish, this week, you've got 25% of the metagame in Mardu vehicles right now, basically, which is a lot. You're going to face that a lot.
Yes,
and then 12% is in green-black aggro, and another 12% in green-black energy. So right there, I mean, that's half the metagame just in those really low decks. And then you start seeing things like Jeskai Control at 10%, which is, relying on the torrential gear hulks. And then you start getting into the copycats around 10% also. So, I mean, there is essentially a 50% chance that you're going to face a deck that is just going to try to go under and around you when you sit down at a table right now, according to the metagame. So that's a lot. That's a lot of aggro. So maybe this is a good time to go ahead and just discuss GP Pittsburgh a little bit that just happened. Graham, do you have the top 8 in front of you? What happened in the top?
So something really interesting happened. The Mardu Vehicles decks that dominated the Pro Tour last weekend were unseated by the green-black energy and green-black aggro decks that were kind of in the middle of the pack last week. And Mardu Vehicles, while still around, obviously, kind of got put in its place. It's almost like people were expecting it, and they were gunning for it, and they were handling it, and it kind of, it's Newton's law of equal and opposite force, right? You hit it really hard with the Mardu Vehicles, everyone's going to plan to be seeing the Mardu Vehicles, and so all the decks that aren't Mardu Vehicles that are gunning for it are going to come back with a vengeance and wipe it out, and those are going to be the big decks. So I imagine next weekend, Mardu Vehicles will be right back on top, if not something different, because everybody's going to be gunning for the green-black energy or the green-black aggro decks. So...
Right, and I mean, I don't know if it's fair to say that they were totally knocked out. I mean, there were 8 copies in the top 32, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 copies in the top 32, including 2 in the top 8 still, second and third. So, I mean, they were definitely up there.
2 versus the 6 that were in the Pro Tour top 8.
Yeah, that's true. But it is kind of like, it feels like rock, paper, scissors.
Absolutely. It's going to go back and forth. And it makes me wonder, Colin, do you think that these are the decks that we're going to be seeing in this metagame rotation? You got green, black, you got Mardu, you have Jeskai Control, and you've got some combination for the copycat deck. Those 4, that seems to be the big 4 decks. Do you see anything coming through and unseating that?
I feel like there has to be something out there that will shake it up, because we've never really seen, or at least not recently have we seen a dominant deck just totally, make its way in the top all the way through an entire format. So I feel like there are definitely options and other things out there that can knock them down. I just don't think we've seen them yet. It's early. And also another consideration is that WotC announced and sort of made it possible for them to announce a new set of banned cards at after the Pro Tour. And so, who knows? Maybe Heart of Kirin or Scrapheap Scrounger could disappear in the next couple weeks, which would then change everything again. So, yeah, I have no idea.
Seems to me that they banned Smuggler's Copter because it was deemed unfun. It was a 2-drop, crewed for 1, which is insanely easy, and it was flying, and it had the
looting effect,
and it had the loot. Thank you. I was looking for the word loot. It had the loot effect on it, and they banned it because it was unfun. And then they turned around and they replaced it with a card that I think might even be better because it's more powerful. It's vigilant. It can still be crewed with 1-drops or 2-drops. Just look at the Mardu vehicles, or it can be crewed with a loyalty counter, so it's even more powerful, especially when you compare it with a planeswalker like Gideon. Do you think that Wizards kind of dropped the ball on this one?
I don't necessarily think they dropped the ball. I think that they tried to give it some drawbacks, like being legendary, so you can only have one of them in play at a time. I think it's silly to expect that they would have thought that if Smuggler's Copter got that big, then they would have to deal with it. But yeah, I'm not really sure. It looks like from the things I'm reading about testing in the Future League, they weren't sure how Smuggler's Copter was going to go, and they weren't sure how because it's the first time they have used the vehicle mechanic in a set like ever. It's a new thing. So they're obviously, when things are new, they have to check how they balance in relationship to everything else. And I think that if you look over the history of bannings, you will notice, or you'll be able to see, that usually the first few iterations or the first overpowered versions of a new mechanic or a new thing tend to get banned eventually, because it's really hard to gauge how it's going to fit in when there's no other example of it ahead of time, to sort of no precedent to gauge your level off of. So I don't know. I think that Heart of Kirin is a ridiculous card, and I'm definitely in the we should join it and not try to beat it sort of camp at this point, because I think that unless it gets banned, it's going to continue to be a mainstay and a staple of the powerful decks in Standard for the rest of the time it's there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I personally, I think it's a little bit, I find it hilarious that they banned a card and then replaced it with something just as good, if not better. To me, that just seems silly.
Well, but think about it this way. If they hadn't banned Smuggler's Copter, there would be both. So what would these decks be like if they had both of them?
That's true. And that being said, there's only 2 or 3 decks that are even running Heart of Kirin in the top 8 right now. It's so feared that I think people really went out of their way to shut it down.
Right. And so compare that to early in the format with Smuggler's Copter, where we basically were like, all hail the looting copter, because that's going to be the next thing, because it was in 4 of and in the top 64 when Kaladesh came out. So it's not quite up there the same as Smuggler's Copter was. Scrapheap Scrounger has kind of replaced Smuggler's Copter as the card that's just in all the decks. It just sort of fits everywhere, and it keeps coming back from the graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard
right now, as I'm looking at the deck list, the one that I see most across all the decks, and because there's so much green black, there's a lot of repeats, even though they use a lot of different mechanic types. But I'm seeing a lot of Walking Ballista. That seems to be an obscenely popular and powerful card.
Yes, Walking Ballista is
that,
a big
along
deal.
with Walking Ballista, Winding Constrictor obviously goes very well with Walking Ballista, and as well as the Rishkar. Those 3 seem to be staples of most of the decks I'm seeing in the top 8 right now. Obviously, you can't have the green ones in the Mardu decks or the Jeskai deck.
So once again, we find ourselves with, just like we did at sort of the end of Kaladesh, with a format that is pretty stable. When you have 50% of the metagame using one strategy, in this case aggro, and it's not always aggro, sometimes mid-range is the strategy, like it was with Eldritch Moon. That's easy to sort of consider and brew with and brew against. So that said, maybe we should go ahead and move into our brew for the day. Graham, it is your deck concept, so why don't you lay it out. What are we going to try to accomplish today, and how will that sort of target this metagame?
Yeah, so this week we are going to go in the complete opposite direction from last week. Today we are going to build a mono white vehicles deck, because I do think that vehicles are the driving force, no pun intended, in
Oh,
the
dude,
metagame
pun
right
totally
now.
intended. It's okay to pun on this podcast.
Sure. But I think there are a couple of mechanics that we can exploit and take advantage of that we wouldn't necessarily be able to if we were running multiple colors. And I think that white gives us consistent, or a monocolor deck gives us a consistent land base that allows us to run less lands and more cards, basically. And if we can keep our curve low enough, we can really take advantage of that and really like drive that point home.
So are you sort of envisioning this deck as a sort of white weenies deck with vehicles instead of just creatures?
Absolutely. You can see a lot of the early game staples from Mardu vehicles. So I can't really argue against Thraben Inspector. I can't really argue against Toolcraft Exemplar. Those guys are just super awesome pilots for cards like Aethersphere Harvester and Heart of Kirin. But I kind of want to take it in a little bit different direction, because there's a couple cards that work together that I don't think too many people have really thought about. And I can't take full credit for all of these. Colin, you told me about this combo. Imagine running a Lone Rider with an Aethersphere Harvester in play. That just seems like a really good combo. You can flip your Lone Rider on the turn it comes into play if you do it right. I think that Scrapheap Scrounger even has some value in a mono white deck, because it's still a 2-drop creature that can flip an Aethersphere Harvester. It also turns on Toolcraft Exemplar, which is a really important thing.
Right. So the trade-offs. So we've got some good ideas for some sort of powerful interactions that haven't been done, but what we have to be cognizant of is that we're giving up some pretty powerful cards by sort of limiting ourselves in these colors. Like, for example, Veteran Motorist, which has that scry ability and the quick crew ability for Heart of Kirin. I think we had to make sure that we have something that makes it feel like we're not missing that card. And then also the removal package is going to be completely different, and in my opinion probably not as effective, because you can't really get much more efficient than Fatal Push, and you really can't get much more value, especially running vehicles for artifacts, than Unlicensed Disintegration. So we're going to have to make sure that we're considering, okay, these are key components to how these vehicle decks work, and we're going to have to try to figure out some way to brew around that and make sure we're still effective compared to the decks that are running Mardu.
Absolutely. So I have a couple thoughts on that. I think that the deck isn't going to be quite as aggro as it might seem based on the curve of the deck. I think it's going to be a little bit more mid-rangey. It's just going to be very efficient at it. I envision using things like Vigilance to allow us to attack in while still holding back creatures that can block well. Perhaps using something along the lines of Authority of the Consoles or Athalia to slow down our opponent's aggressive attacking, or using sick creatures to crew their vehicles.
Right. So we'll use those to slow down. So actually, what you're talking about now, making is going larger, is not really the way White Weenies works. Before I start suggesting cards, I want to make sure I know what ballpark I'm in, like which way we're going.
Well, I think we have a lot of room for playing around in this. I think that what we need to do, without kind of pigeonholing ourselves into a certain range, is build a deck that can take on a green-black aggro/energy deck as well as a Mardu vehicles.
Right. So it needs to be fast enough that it won't get blown out and destroyed by the super aggro ones, but it also needs to be big enough that it can cope when Verdurous Gear Hulks and Mind Rack Demons start hitting the battlefield. Okay. So let's go ahead and just add some cards to this list that you feel like are the shoo-in cards for this deck.
Okay. So I think that Heart of Kirin is a shoo-in.
Okay, so we're not going budget this week. Sorry.
We have to win every once in a while.
Every once in a while we have to win. Okay. This one's for Daniel. Let's win.
We have to go Gideon, because that's what you do.
Okay, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar.
I can't really see an argument against either Thraben Inspector or Toolcraft Exemplar.
Okay.
And as far as absolute must-haves, that is probably it. Now we have a couple choices to make, and we have a couple of different routes we can go. And there are a couple different card combinations that we might be able to talk about, or specific cards that we can discuss the pros and cons of. I mentioned one earlier, Authority of the Consuls, and or Thalia, which both kind of have a similar ability. They're just played at different times. So Authority of the Consul being a 1-drop and an enchantment has its benefits because you get to take advantage of it immediately. Plus you get some life out of it. Whereas Thalia is a creature, so she can attack, she can crew, she can do all the other stuff as well.
Yeah, I feel like I like Thalia better for a deck that wants to crew Heart of Kiran, in particular, because Authority of the Consuls, if you want to draw it early, you have to put a lot of copies in, and it's an enchantment that basically does nothing in multiples. I guess. Well, I guess it gives you an extra life if they play creature, but that's not really what you want to be doing. Is playing a second Authority of the Consuls.
Okay, I like that. I like that argument. I can't really see much against it. Another interesting card combination that I had considered was Fleetwheel Cruiser. Seems to be something that people like to run in the aggro decks that has definitely helped quite a bit. And it's only got a crew of 2, and there's an interesting card in white, Gearshift Ace, that might pair really nicely with the Fleetwheel Cruiser. So Fleetwheel Cruiser being a 5/3 vehicle for 4. It's got trample and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So you get a free use out of Fleetwheel Cruiser, and then you have to crew it in order to use it, but it's got a pretty low threshold. Now, Gearshift Ace is a 2/1 for 1 and a white, and it has first strike, but it also grants first strike to anything it's crewing, which would be really nice in a vehicle with high power and low toughness, not to mention trample.
Right. Well, that makes sense. So Fleetwheel Cruiser costs 4. That's my only gripe with Fleetwheel Cruiser.
Yeah, and so maybe that's just a 1 or a 2 of, but it might be an interesting combination to have in the deck, considering we do need this deck to have a little bit more lasting power than a true aggro deck.
Right. Okay. So I can see that. I can see that being okay for the high end. I'm just wondering, like, Gideon is pretty much the best 4-drop you can play in this deck, I think. And so it's like, how disappointed would you be if you just drew a Fleetwheel Cruiser? And does this deck want more than, 4 or 6 4-drops? So we'll see.
Well, that's a really good question. We have a couple of options in the 4-drop spot, and Fleetwheel Cruiser was just one of those combinations. I like it because it pairs with the Gearshift Ace, and I think that the Gearshift Ace, without a veteran motorist, I feel like Gearshift Ace might be the next best crew component for a deck of this nature. And I think that the first strike gives a unique advantage in the sense that if you crew a Heart of Kiran, obviously in conjunction with another creature, and you're fighting in order to block or attack against somebody else's Heart of Kiran, your Heart of Kiran wins because first strike.
Right.
We're seeing so many Hearts of Kiran that it's inevitable that eventually they're going to match up with each other.
Okay. I can see that. So let's put a couple of those on the list for now. What type of removal are you thinking? Because removal is very important.
There are 3 cards that I had in mind. We'll probably end up choosing 2 of them. So the cards that I was thinking of were Blessed Alliance, which everybody knows is freaking great. You can use it to have your opponent sacrifice a creature that's attacking you. You can gain life if you need it. You can untap your own creatures if you need them. For instance, in a circumstance where you need to untap crew in order to crew a vehicle. The other one that I was considering was Gideon's Reproach, which is 1 and a white for an instant. Gideon's Reproach deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Now, that's not always going to be a kill shot, but for most decks it is. It takes out Heart of Kiran in either a blocking or attacking circumstance. It takes out most of the crewing type creatures that may be attacking you in those instances. It gets
Grim Flare
Tracker. It gets Grim Flare. It doesn't hit Mind Rack Demon. That's an important one.
And then probably lastly, won't hit a Virtuous Gear Hulk either if it's given itself at least 1 counter.
Right. It probably won't hit that. And the last one I was considering, which is just a pretty solid staple in general, is an Immolating Glare. So imagine having either Gideon's Reproach or Immolating Glare in your hand as well as a Blessed Alliance. Your opponent thinks they've got you cornered. They +1 Gideon to make him a an indestructible creature until end of turn, and they swing at you with their Heart of Kirin, which they crew with their Gideon's loyalty counter, and they swing at you for that flying, indestructible 9 damage. You drop a Blessed Alliance on the stack, and then you drop an Immolating Glare or Gideon's Reproach on the stack to destroy their Heart of Kirin, leaving them only one choice to sacrifice their indestructible Gideon.
Yeah, that sounds like it'd be a very good play. I don't know that. I feel like that's definitely like a major ceiling. I don't know if that's really going to happen that much or ever, but I can see the value in it. I'm wondering if yeah, because here's the thing. So this goes back to another conversation that we usually have to have when we're deciding sort of which direction the deck is going to go. If we're playing 3 and 4 drops and we're going mid-rangey as well, or going a little bit higher, like if we're playing cards like Fleetwheel Cruiser, that makes cards like Immolating Glare or Gideon's Reproach to be not as good because we're less likely to have the mana up. Like you have to have 4 mana up in order to do that scenario that you just outlined. And your opponent has to think about that, and they have to think about if they're going to attack into you that way with 4 mana up, knowing, potentially like maybe that'll get them, but like game 2, they're going to know how to attack you, like, so it's going to be tricky. And I don't know I'm wondering if something a little bit more universal like Declaration in Stone is going to be a thing. Because, it's not great to give the Marty Vehicles deck an artifact, but it's also pretty much impossible for them not have one anyway. So I don't know that it's going to be that big of a deal to do that. And it also exiles, so if you hit a Scrap Heap Scrounger, then it just goes away, it never comes back. But, I think that out of the 3 that you mentioned, Blessed Alliance is the one that I'm most interested in because of its versatility. Obviously, when you have a card that has different modes, gain 4 life, untap up to 2 target creatures, or opponent sacrifices an attacking creature, I think that there are a lot of cases when they are attacking with just one vehicle because it takes 2 creatures to crew it, or because they want to hold up things for blockers or whatever. And so I think that there is probably a case where we'll see that a little bit more. But I'm not as interested in...
Okay, well, why don't we... I like Declaration in Stone a lot. I think it's a great card, and I think you have a good point about the mana that is required to be up, and maybe that is a good reason to push us in a lower curve. As we discovered in our deck last week, 4 drops complicate things. We learned that with Mercurial Geist, especially when we want to be playing multiple spells and doing multiple things on our turn or our opponents. So why don't we do Blessed Alliance and Declaration in Stone? I think that's a great combination. I think that they work really well.
Okay, yeah, I think that's good because we're gonna want some kind of removal for sure. And at the worst case scenario, if we have to gain the 4 life to flip some Lone Riders, that's not the worst thing ever. So we want to kind of keep this low. So what vehicles, like I'm more interested in Aethersphere Harvester than I am in Fleetwheel Cruiser, but maybe the Fleetwheel Cruiser is in the sideboard and switches out if we need it. But it just costs 4, and it's just really hard. It costs 4.
Yeah, I can see that. So maybe we ought to dump the Fleetwheel Cruiser and run Aethersphere Harvesters instead. I like the life gain ability. I like the fact that they can block a Heart of Kirin and survive.
Right, yeah.
That's pretty cool. In fact, it would be even cooler if we could find a way for Aethersphere Harvester to kill Heart of Kirin.
Right, so we are losing the +1/+1 ability that the Veteran Motorist gives it because we're not running red. So what do you have in mind to do that?
Well, I was kind of thinking about Always Watching. It's a card you don't see too much of in standard play because it has 2 devotion to white as a 3-drop, which makes it a little harder to cast in multicolored decks. But because we're running a monocolored deck and the value of Vigilance is so high, I think that Always Watching might be something worth considering for the deck.
Okay. I think it is too. I think that if we go in an Always Watching direction, then we probably want to play more regular creatures and less vehicles. And my reasoning for that is, even if your creatures are vigilant, no matter what, you still have to tap them to crew the vehicles. So they're going to be tapped if you're doing that. So I almost feel like the best thing to do would be to consider it like, okay, put in creatures that you actually want to attack with and vehicles that you want to block with, because you'll have the vehicles up, you'll attack with the creatures, they won't tap, so they're available to crew for block, and your opponent has to think about how they're going to attack into you, if they're going to attack into these vehicles, and which like basically puts the vehicles in combat and not your creatures, which means they're likely to survive more and to attack the next turn.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's good. But I think that if we decide to go in an always watching direction, we're going to end up with less vehicles, like, 6, like 4 Heart of Kirin and 2 Aethersphere Harvesters, and that's it, kind of thing.
Actually, those numbers aren't terrible, and they kind of jive with a lot of the Mardu vehicles list. Most of the Mardu vehicle lists that I've seen run 4 Heart of Kirin and maybe 1 Aethersphere Harvester.
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that 6 is plenty for this deck.
Right. Well, the deck from GP Pittsburgh that got second place Mardu vehicle actually only has 5. It has 3 Hearts of Kirin and 2 Aethersphere Harvesters, so it's basically a white small creature deck too.
Right.
Okay, but I think that we're gonna want 6 though for this one. So
yeah, I think that 6 is probably the number.
So if that's the case, do we still want the Gear Shift Ace because it can't crew Heart of Kirin? Well, I guess if you have one always watching, it can, but that's tough.
Yeah, it pairs with Thraben Inspector to crew for first strike. Also, it is first strike, so it can block a rampaging Scrap Heap Scrounger by itself. The number of 2 toughness creatures in standard right now are so high that Gearshift Ace, just in its first strike ability, might be worth having.
That's true. So without a Gideon emblem, all of the creatures in the Mardu Vehicles deck would die to Gearshift Ace, or it would survive it. They all have toughness 1 or 2. But
yeah,
the red-green deck is a bit more
Avengers...
trouble. Or the black-green deck.
Right.
Okay, so as long as we're cool with that, so yeah, I think Gearshift Ace can make the list for now. We'll see how it goes. One card that is removal that we haven't talked about yet that is also very popular, and since we're already running Gideons, since we're already running Heart of Kirins, so please, listeners, if you try this deck, proxy it, please. But it'll be fun, I think. A good removal card that is any color is Walking Ballista, and is also seeing a lot of play right now. So I feel like if we really are trying to stay up with the top tier decks and we don't have Fatal Push or Unlicensed Integration, I feel like we have to run Walking Ballista.
How do you feel like that fits into the mana curve?
Well, the cool thing about it is it kind of fits anywhere. So for the green and black decks, you can hold it longer, and you can then play it and sort of zap the bigger creatures, or you can just use it to stabilize the early game against the Mardu Vehicles decks or the small decks that where basically you play it and, because you can block and then you can zap, so the damage doesn't get through, and you can usually, take out 1 or 2 things, and it's really good for knocking out their little 1 toughness crew creatures. So
yeah, the only problem I see with it is I consider it minimum a 4-drop to be effective. So otherwise, it's a 2 mana, 1 damage spell, which is not very good at all.
Yeah, that's true. But
at that point, you might as well run dual shots. Obviously, wrong color, but the point stands.
Okay. I just think that it's the versatility of it and the threat of it on the battlefield changes things in your favor a lot and makes your opponent think about how they're going to do things. So maybe it's not a 4
Absolutely.
of. Maybe it's just for later in the game. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't have red, you don't have black, removal is a lot worse. And it's very important. And so Walking Ballista is a good removal card. And it can zap Saheeli, even if you play it for 2 to break the cat combo. Because that's still a thing, even though it's not doing as well as everybody was afraid it was going to. It's still definitely a thing. So, I don't know. It sounds like you don't like it, though.
I guess I'm just not sure where it fits in the curve. It usually pairs up with the Winding Constrictor, which makes it exponentially better because it's automatically going to get you get 2 free mana out of it.
Sure.
I mean, if I was looking at, if we consider it a 4-drop, instead of Walking Ballista, I would almost rather have an Odric in the deck, because if we are running Gearshift Ace, that gives all of our creatures first strike. If we are running something like Lone Rider, all of a sudden all of our creatures have lifelink. If we crew a vehicle like Aethersphere Harvester or Heart of Kirin, all of our creatures then gain vigilance and or flying.
That's true.
And those are all. That's a really mean combination. If all of a sudden all of our creatures have first strike, not to mention it can crew. It can crew a Heart of Kirin all on its own. It can crew an Aethersphere Harvester by itself.
Well, it better for 4 mana.
It's true. But, its ability speaks for itself.
Sure, but think about this. So I will say I think Audric is a very good idea for a 2-of, to be at sort of the other 2 4-drops if we have 2 Gideons on the list. The interesting thing about Walking Ballista that nobody's talked about is that you can play it for 2 to get the counter on it, but if you have always watching in play, you can zap something and the Ballista will still survive.
That's true.
Which is an interesting thing. So it's not nearly as big of a loss, because I'm assuming you're going to want to play if we're sort of focusing on the always watching thing, we're going to want to make sure we play that a lot of the always watchings, because it's kind of like it forces you in such a direction that you need to go all in order to make it work, I think.
Okay, well let's do that. Let's go all in on always watching. Let's run 4.
Okay, so we'll run 4 always watchings, which hopefully will get those a good percentage of the time and be able to get a little bit bigger. It's kind of a debilitating turn 3 play. When that happens, it really changes how the race is going or how your opponent thinks is going to go. And also because it's a card that's not getting very much play right now, they might be able to guess that's coming because we're playing mono white, but it is also maybe something they're not as prepared for, which I think is pretty good. But I still think Walking Ballista is, at least at this point, is still in the conversation. It should be there.
Yeah, I agree, especially if it survives based on an always watching. So right now, turn 1 plays, we've got 4 Thraben Inspectors and 4 Toolcraft Exemplars. I don't think anybody's going to argue against those picks ever.
Right.
Turn 2, we've got Heart of Kirin's and Gearshift Aces.
And Lone Riders.
Gearshift Ace and Lone Riders. I think Gearshift Ace is up for debate. It does have first strike, and it grants your vehicles first strike, but Thalia also has first strike. And if we get an Odric into play, that first strike gets broadcast amongst the rest of our creatures. That being said, Thalia is also legendary, so that becomes somewhat problematic.
I think that playing 2 Thalias and 2 Odrics is perfectly reasonable, and we shouldn't run into the legendary problem that much running that few.
Maybe we ought to drop the Gearshift Ace. So if we're running 4 Thrabes, 4 Toolcraft Exemplars, that's 8 1-drops, and then not counting our removal, we've got 8 2-drops in Heart of Kirin and Lone Rider, and we've got 8 3-drops in Aethersphere Harvester, Always Watching, and Thalias, and then we've got 4 4-drops in Gideon and Odric, as well as 8 removal spells for a grand total of...
Well, we're going to have to make some cuts, so we're going to have to make some more decisions, because we don't have enough... We don't have enough Gideons on there, and we don't have enough Walking Ballistas.
To me, so we've got a total of 62 cards. If we drop the 2 Gearshift Aces, that puts us at 60 even. So you've got 1 Walking Ballista in here right now. I might even say drop. So if we drop the Gearshift Aces, or if we go 2 Lone Rider, 2 Gearshift Ace, because the Lone Riders are really best when they pair with our Aethersphere Harvester. We've only got 2 of those.
Right. So how many Gearshift Aces did you want?
Why don't we go 2 Gearshift, 2 Lone Riders?
Okay.
And why don't we do 3 Heart of Kirin and 2 Aethersphere Harvesters? And that leaves us room for an additional Walking Ballista. If I'm doing my math correctly, which I don't know if I am. We may still be at 62 cards.
No,
that's
I think
59 right there.
Yeah, so then we can do 2 Walking Ballistas. Yeah, so then we can do 2 Walking Ballistas.
Yeah, and that puts us at 60 cards.
Okay, so now we have 60 cards, but let's really think through for a second before we sign off and make sure that we have our lines going through and make sure that we feel like it's more powerful in what we want. So we have 4 Declaration of Stone, and 4 Blessed Alliance, and 2 Walking Ballistas for removal. So that's 4 hard removal cards that are sorcery speed, 2 limited removal cards that are instant speed with Walking Ballista, and 4 Blessed Alliance, which your opponent gets to choose. So I feel like this is definitely where we're going to have trouble, is removing big threats in this deck. But I also don't feel like there's a lot of big options for us to take.
Yeah, I think that's also something that we can deal with in the sideboard. So we could run Immolating Glares in the sideboard for when we run up against the big over-the-top, tall Gearhulk decks. As opposed to Blessed Alliance, we can use Immolating Glare to target their Gearhulk.
Sure.
We have a little bit of... We can take out the Walking Ballistas that we know are not going to be effective against cards like that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So Walking Ballista is going to be much more effective against Mardu vehicles than it is going to be against a green-black energy.
Right. I'm just checking through real quick other white creatures that are low curve, just to make sure we didn't miss something obvious when we were putting this together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I went through all of the white creatures in Standard right now. I mean, there's Trusty Companion,
right,
which is Vigilant. So that could be useful just because you can attack with it and crew with it later to block.
What's its power?
So you can 3. So you can attack with it along with the Heart of Kirin, and then you can use it to crew that Heart of Kirin to block.
Oh yeah, because it says it can't attack alone, but that's not as big of a deal as being able to crew on the block. I kind of almost like Trusty Companion better than Gearshift Ace, just because it can crew Heart of Kirin.
Well, do you like it better than Gearshift Ace, or do you like it better than Lone Rider?
I like it better than Gearshift Ace.
Okay, well, let's go and make that switch. I think that's something that we can determine in testing, because Lone Rider is either going to be freaking great or it's not going to work at all.
Right. Well, it needs the Harvesters. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
We also don't have any scry or card draw in this deck.
We have plenty of card draw because we got 4 Thraben Inspectors. Oh, we got 4 Thraben Inspectors. I guess that's not plenty.
Right. Well, so do we want SRAM Senior Edificer to help us with card draw?
That is something I had considered. However, there will only be 5 cards that affect him.
That's true. Because we're not playing... Yeah. Well, we could look at the auras, too.
Yeah, we could play Caught in the Brights. It's more expensive. We could play Thopter. Nope, that doesn't count either. Most of the other good white removals are just straight up enchantments.
Right.
There's only really Caught in the Brights is pretty much the only good aura control, and it costs 3, so that's not ideal.
Right. Yeah, they pretty much all cost 3. Okay. Yeah, I think that I think it's good, but I'm just worried that it's just not as good as running Mardu and getting the good removal. That's what I'm worried about.
I think that the key to this deck is going to be the Always Watching. I think that vigilance in general is an underrated ability that I think you can see with Heart of Kirin just how effective it is. And I think that +1/+1 bump you're going to get from it is also going to be more important than you might expect.
Right, because racing the vehicles decks now, we're running the same number of vehicles. We have about the same amount of ability to crew those vehicles, but we only have to crew them when we're blocking. And so we can attack with the creatures, hopefully. I mean, I guess they could double block and just take out a lot of our stuff. But, hopefully we can get better.
Theoretically, their creatures will be tapped down and they won't be able to block.
Right, against the vehicles deck. Yeah, right. Okay. So let's see where we're at right now. We've got 2 Lone Riders, 2 Audrix, 2 Thalias, 4 Thraben Inspectors, 4 Toolcraft Exemplars, 2 Trusty Companions, and 2 Walking Ballistas in the main. And we can we can put 2 more in the sideboard and add and subtract those. We've got 2 Aethersphere Harvesters and 3 Heart of Kirins, 4 Always Watchings, 4 Blessed Alliance, 4 Declaration Stones, 2 Gideon Ally of Zendikar. That feels pretty good. I wonder so one thing is that right now with the Harvester, we're not doing anything else with energy that is going to allow us to recharge our Harvester should we get it early. And I think the lifelink is kind of a real thing.
Yeah.
But
I think, though, that that's 2 energy. That gets us hopefully at least 6 life, which in and of itself is not an insignificant amount of life. That might be enough to buy us time, which is really what we're looking for in this deck. Plus, if there's Always Watchings in play, that 6 quickly becomes 8 or 10.
Right.
So the fact that we only get to use it twice, I don't think is as detrimental as it might seem.
Yeah, and there isn't really anything in white that actually gives you energy as much as Ether Geode Miner, which when it attacks, you get 2 energy. But they're just going to kill that.
Yeah. We could always run a couple Aether hubs, understanding, if we run 4 Aether hubs, unless we end up drawing 3 of them in one hand, we have such a solid base of planes going for us anyway that who knows, maybe those 4 extra energy you get out of them might be worthwhile. Worst comes to worst, you play it and you have to use it for white.
Yeah, because I was looking at Ether Geode Miner. I was like, okay, so do I like that better even than Trusty Companion? Ether Geode Miner is kind of complicated. It's 1 and a white for a 3/1 Dwarf Scout. Whenever it attacks, you get 2 energy. So that attracted me right there because I was like, okay, so if we don't spend it, then we get that energy and we can use it for the harvesters. You can pay 2 energy to exile it and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So if you have 2 energy, it's kind of instant speed, or even it's removal proof in a way, except for if you have to sacrifice it.
Well, it's also useful in blocking and crewing. So you can attack with it to get 2 energy, and then when your opponents attack you, you can pay 2 energy to blink it, and then use it to crew your Heart of Kirin to block.
Right, and then with always watching it, wouldn't tap to attack anyway. So that's true, but it has 1 toughness out of the box, so that means that Walking Ballista can easily take it out. Shock can easily take it out.
Yeah, I think that always watching negates its purpose, because I think that's really why they have it in there. It's a dwarf, which tends to be the crew ability, the crew creatures. It's got 3 power, which kind of alludes to me that it's there to crew vehicles. And I think that that's kind of the way they envisioned using it. Attack with it to get the energy, blink it to make it crewable.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you can't crew and attack with the creature in the same turn this way.
No, it's not meant to be in the same turn.
Oh, I see.
It's meant to attack with it and then block with your vehicle.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's true. I feel like in this deck in particular, that's how it would be used. I think that its real or its original intention is a revolt enabler, which we're not using in any revolt in this deck because revolt's just not that strong. We found out. So it blinks something and potentially every turn or whenever you need to, or whenever you happen to have 2 energy, so that you can get your revolt triggers to go. But I think we should give the Trusty Companion a chance. I think it's an interesting pick.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
It feels like a limited card, but it's got vigilance, which is a good keyword, and for 3/2 for 2. And when you're crewing things, if you have a Heart of Kirin out, you don't care that it can't attack alone.
Right, and even with Toolcraft Exemplar, that is also something that allows it that you can attack with. If you have enough artifacts in play, Toolcraft Exemplar gets first strike, and so both of them get better. Somehow you get an Odric into play, and then all of a sudden everybody gets stronger.
Yeah, okay.
I think that this deck has a lot of potential. I think it's going to be one of the decks that is going to require some tuning out of the gate. So don't expect us to come back next week with an identical card list. Expect some changes, perhaps even on the Jurassic side, but I think it is a good start.
Yeah, the big test is going to be, do we feel like it's smoother and easier and more reliable than running 3 colors for Marty Vehicles? Because Marty Vehicles does take advantage of all the fast lands that work for it, so you typically get your untapped lands and colors, and it's pretty good mana base with the Spire of Industries and everything too. So is simplifying and going down to 1 color better, and we are using a lot of the same powerful cards for beating down, so I'm pretty confident that will work. I'm just curious to see if losing, and this will be the test. This is why we test things. This is what we're doing for science this time, to see if the efficiency and the use of always watching and those things will be greater than being able to have the cheaper removal in black. So yeah. I mean, Declaration Stone is good, and it's really good against token strategy. It's much better than Fatal Push against tokens. So, yeah, I'd be interested to see. Cool.
Okay, well, that's our deck for this week. Let us know how it goes when you guys run it. Sorry about the astronomical cost of the deck, so maybe use proxies to let us know how it goes. And remember that, again, as usual, we didn't get a chance to talk about the sideboard. So let us know what you guys ended up putting into the deck for your local metagame.
Yep, and do apologize when we make non-budget decks. We really do try on the podcast to make cheaper decks that you can actually go and try out and be like, oh, I have most of those cards, and it's not too much if you really wanted to. But since it's a first draft, and since this is kind of a specific experiment targeting a specific type, and these cards are just so important right now, we felt like this week hopefully you'll give us a pass and we can get away with a slightly more expensive deck, and we'll go back to the more cost effective for your wallet decks later. But anyway, I think that's great. I think I don't think there's any cards that made it on the list, Graham, that Daniel would have shuddered too hard at to keep out of there. So I think pretty good about that. Well,
yep, he may not love Always Watching, and he might at first balk at Trusted Companion.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Audric is the most suspect one that I see on that list. A 4-mana creature that's may or may not give you the advantage. So we'll see. We'll see. It's fine. It'll be great. I'm really excited to see how this one tests out against the test gauntlet, and hopefully we'll get a chance to run it, and hopefully the testing will be a little bit smoother this week than it was last week. It was just unfortunate, but that's how it goes. So great. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. That will be our show for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
That's right. Tell all of your friends. Get excited.
Don't forget to subscribe to our show on YouTube, and you can even friend us on tappedout.net, which is where we post our deck lists from the live brews, and we try to put all of the cards that we talk about, even if they don't make it into the deck list, we put them in the maybeboard so that you can follow along with the discussion if you happen to be sitting at your computer while you're listening.
Yep. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. That's really important. We try to respond to as many of those as we possibly can.
Yep, and Tapped Out also allows you to make suggestions and suggestion cards. So if we were having this conversation and you were sitting there going, but this card, are they going to mention this card? Nope, they never mentioned that card. We want to know what that card was that we missed and that we didn't think of, and what you would put in the deck. So make sure you put it as a suggestion on the deck list and Tapped Out, and the link to the deck will be in the show notes wherever you get your podcasts. So definitely do that. And if you don't like going on to Tapped Out, or if you prefer getting us hold of us a different way, please come find us on Twitter. Our account is @moxzirconia, and you can also email us directly if you want to send us a list at moxzirconia@gmail.com. And Twitter seems to be where a lot of the Magic community overall is. All of the pro players have very, very active Twitter accounts. All of the content creators have very, very active Twitter accounts. A lot of the news and a lot of the things comes down in the community through Twitter, and it is very alive. So even if you don't have Twitter and you were considering they've mentioned Twitter every week, should I care about Twitter? It's where I get most of my information on the Magic community, to be perfectly honest. It's extremely active, and so I think it's great. So come find us, say hi, and give us a follow, and then you'll get updates from us quicker that way as well.
Yep, and thank you so much for listening. We will see you guys back here next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.